Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. It's awesome that you're tuning in. So in the jungle of handhelds, boy man, there are so many of these things for sale. But I'm going to make some more like different top 10 videos. But in this video, you already see the title, I'm going to focus on the budget handhelds. What are fun budget handhelds to get for your collection and which one are decent enough for your money. Stay tuned, consider subscribing here to the Wicked Gamer and Collector, and let's go with the top 10 budget handhelds from China. Alright, so for the number 10 position I choose the Retro FC 168 in 1. Yes, and the reason why is very simple. Oh, by the way, there will be the only 8-bit system in this top 10 for the budget lineup. Because nowadays we also have multiple, let's say, all-in-one devices that can play quite some different systems. The 3-inch display that comes in this, it's super wide LCD, but most of them have more like a very poor view angle. So it comes with 168 games, nothing more. You can't add games, what you see, what you're going to get. But in general, I think this is just a really cool thing to have in a collection or to bring with you and to play some old school 8-bit stuff. So yeah, the Retro FC, the 168 one, I think it's one of the most decent 8-bit systems out there. And there are many of them of these 8-bit, but nevertheless, it's very cheap. And in general, the collection was not that bad. AV out function, there is no way of adding a second controller, but personally I don't really care about it. So this is what you're going to get with the FC 168 retro game system, and including a battery. Alright, so for the number 9 position I choose the X6, or known as the P3000. It's the PlayStation Portable ripoff from a friend from China. Yes guys, so this thing has been around for a very long time, and even in this video it says on the box upgraded edition. No idea what was upgraded because the gameplay was pretty choppy. And I think this will be always the common problem with this multi-platform system, that is just basically cheap. Doesn't even matter if you're going to get this one, the X6 or the P3000, more like the upgraded edition. Nevertheless, they are just very cheap. They have support for multiple platforms that you can run, like arcade, 8-bit, 16-bit, but the emulation is pretty damn choppy. But still, therefore I'm going to give it the number 9 position. Right, so the P3000 or the PlayStation Portable ripoff, the controls were pretty choppy too. They had just a basic widescreen display. You had TV out option, headphone, you could transfer the data from the system. Most of them had an 8 or 16 gigabyte internal storage. You can also extend it with a 16-bit or 32 gigabyte SD card. So there were some options with the device, but take in consideration that emulation was pretty choppy and it was not that great. Not even to start about the camera. It has a feature to listen to music and you can watch some movies on this horrible display. Nevertheless, it's more of the same when it comes to these X6 P3000 devices. So let me know in the comments what do you think of this, and don't forget, let me know, did you even buy something like this even before making this video? I just wanted to know, and yeah, what is your opinion about this? I'm going to give this the number 9 because it's still somehow playable with some games, and yeah, it's cheap, and what can we expect from the money? Yeah, this. Okay, so next up, we are going to take a close look at the X12 Plus. Yeah people, 7 inches of fun. This was a gigantic handheld, and of course they need to rip off the Nintendo Switch somehow. So they just used the course theme. Okay, but the reason why I put it on this position is because not of the software. No, the reason why I put it on, because in looking at the price and what you're going to get, it's, to be honest, quite in good value. If you're looking at the previous model, it was not a very expensive device. This thing is a little bit more expensive. But when you're looking at what you're going to get, 7-inch display, it still has the same choppy menu and the same choppy software. As you can see, it's gigantic when you're comparing this to the real Nintendo Switch. And the display is just very big. But don't get me wrong, the display itself, it's just a basic display, not an IPS. And that's also the reason why it's a little bit cheaper than other devices that are more like in the same measurements of the display, but most of them are very expensive, around $70 up to $100. It's a really cheap device, really horrible camera. It has 16 GB storage, a mono speaker. The controls and the joysticks are just awful, but that's what we're going to get on most of these budget devices. An IPS display, yeah, that's something we can dream of because it will never happen in price range like this, or maybe in 2030. But nevertheless, the software was also the same. It looks not really similar like the previous model, like the X6 or the P3000. When we're looking closer, you can see there are some similarities. But nevertheless, with this device, a 7-inch display combined with a lot of stuff that it can emulate, it was not the best emulation I've seen, but for the money, we can't complain, and for a budget device, Alright, so for this position we are going to choose the 5-game simulator. Yeah, a really strange name, not really original. But this thing looks pretty cool in my opinion. It's more like this mini game that you can bring with you, and the name already says it. It's a 5-in-1 emulator handheld. Sadly, it was not the best one, of course, when it comes to emulation. I think that is just a common problem with these budget devices. But for the money, this thing is also very cheap and it plays decent. The D-pad was not the best, but what you're going to get with the device for your money was pretty impressive in my opinion. With a lot of these handhelds, it had a built-in but removable battery. Then also we had an option to have an AV out function, so we hook it up to an old school CRT or a monitor with SCART function. It's not the best quality, but it's an extra that you can do with this device. Also, this device was not perfect in many ways. The emulation was pretty choppy, the controls were not very smoothly, especially when you're looking at the D-pad. It plays pretty choppy in my opinion. So with the menu, it supports NES, Game Boy Advance, Mega Drive, Super Famicom and MAME. So it's pretty funny to see a device for not a lot of money that supports all of these games. Nevertheless, yeah, and the reason why I'm putting it a little bit higher in this list, because it has some compatibility with multiple games, not running perfectly, don't get me wrong, because this thing still has a lot of choppy gameplay, but it was playable and looks slightly better than the previous models. Alright, so this year there were a lot of releases of cheap devices and they were capable of running different systems. This was called the open source arcade. Yeah, those names make no sense whatsoever. It's just a Q8 and it's not really a D-pad, more like this bowl shaped weird looking button that needs to be more like a D-pad. Nevertheless, it was pretty horrible when you feel it, but when you really go to play it, it was not that bad. And no, it's not a Supreme brand. This is just another China, very cheap, look-alike open source arcade, that's how they call it, handheld. The display itself was just a basic device like all the other devices. A 2.8 inch non-IPS, just an old school LCD, but it also has support like NES, MAME, Mega Drive, Game Boy Advance and Super Famicom. And yep, the gameplay or the emulation was pretty choppy compared with all the previous models that I've reviewed here in this top 10. I can still remember this thing comes pre-installed with a 512 MB card. Yeah, seriously, it was really funny and it was a very long time I have seen such a small card. It also comes with an AV out function. I thought it was pretty genius that we're having cheap devices but still having AV out options. Yeah, for nothing special, toilet paper manual and of course the charge cable micro USB. What I really like about this handheld is it has more like the 6 buttons of a fight stick or more like an arcade machine. And I think maybe that's the reason why they call it the open source arcade whatever handheld. So the XYCQ8, that makes this thing pretty unique in my opinion when it comes to the button layout and the horrible weird looking shitty D-pad. Cheap LCD display inside, but it was not really bad. When you're looking at this view angle, you can see that it's still very readable. And that is something you don't see with these cheap devices. And no, it's not an IPS. But the menu itself looks very similar to the other one. Don't you think so? Okay, the gameplay, same story. It runs pretty choppy. And especially when you're looking at some of the games like MAME, it was really horrible. But yeah, that's what we're going to get. And I'm sorry guys, I keep repeating myself. This is what you're going to get for the money and with cheap devices like this. But the reason why this thing is a little bit higher in the list is simply due of the controls. The D-pad feels quite awful but doesn't play that bad, and the same goes for the 6 button layout. I think it's pretty cool, especially when you love playing fighting games. I think it's something they did a very good job. Display itself is not that super bad and the gameplay, yeah, it's just choppy with a shitload of screen tearing. Okay guys, so next up we're going to talk about one of the classics and still one of my favorites. So this is the Powkiddy, the Powkiddy 2 and the Powkiddy 3. And nowadays the prices depends a little bit where you find them, because you can't find them that often because they are pretty old. But I find the emulation was not bad compared with the X6 back in the day. Therefore I'm just going to put it on a little bit higher list. These displays were similar like the cheap devices, non-IPS, just normal LCDs. But the reason why I wanted to put 2 devices on one position, because basically they are the same. They're looking not similar to each other, but when it comes to the software, here we're going to get just basically the same product on the inside. So therefore I was thinking, hey, I'm going to put all these in the list. I really like the menu and the way how it works. It works very smooth. Yeah, the joystick and D-pads are just awful with these things. I must say the D-pad and the 4 buttons on the Powkiddy V90 is a little bit better than the Powkiddy V2. But if you're looking at more like all the other devices, the cheap ones, this one was not bad at all. And the emulation was not that bad either. So that is how I'm going to put it in the top 10. It's a little bit slightly higher in the list, but nevertheless, it was not bad for the money. The support of games was similar like the other device I've reviewed. It's more like MAME, 8-bit, 16-bit stuff. And no, there is no PlayStation N64 or whatsoever, because these are just cheap devices and real oldies. Next up, we have another multi-platform emulator. This was the Gamebox Power M3, the SUP edition. Nothing to do with SUP, the Chinese just use SUP on it. Don't ask me why they do it, maybe to sell more of these things. Nevertheless, we're going to call this the Gamebox Power version. But what you're going to get with this version was similar like all the other ones, but it was slightly better here and there. To begin with, it didn't have a D-pad, it has more like an analog slider like the PSP. And not to be compared with PSP, because the PSP joysticks were way better than this one. But yeah, again, cheap devices, cheap parts. What I'd also like about it was the layout, and I mean with the 6 buttons, because all the buttons you're going to get and what you're going to need for the old stuff that was supported, like 8-bit, 16-bit, MAME, and no PlayStation 1, just the old school stuff. Yes, Mega Drive, or maybe even MAME. So that's what you're going to get with the really cheap devices, and therefore they're still not really high up in this list. But okay, so when you're looking at the controls, as you can see over here, the analog stick, I liked it for what it is. And therefore it's going to be a little bit higher in my list. The audio itself was pretty decent. Yeah, the display was a little bit weird how they put it in the system. As you can see, there is some space between the glass and the display itself. Quite interesting, but it was not really bad, because it also included a quick load, quick save, something you don't see very often with the really cheap devices. Alright, so a cheap device, another one bites the dust. But yeah, for the money we can't complain. The display was pretty decent, not very huge, not an IPS, just a basic very old LCD display. Similar like the first one, the 168-in-1 I've reviewed. And yeah, that's what we're going to get on most of the very cheap devices that you can find in China. Alright, so on the number 3 I choose it for the Family Pocket. And no, this is not the version of the 8-bit only. No, this is a simulator Family Pocket. This was the new edition that came with a pre-built 5-in-1, if I'm saying it correctly, the emulators. Nevertheless, it's more like similar version I've now shown you in this top 10, only it was slightly better in my opinion. It got a very nice display. Yeah, the D-pad was not the best I felt, because they are feeling all not that great with all these cheap handhelds so far, I know. But with this thing, especially the old model, it was just a very cheap device. But now, for the same amount of money, or almost the same amount of money, we're going to get a device that can run all the stuff that we can see with the previous models. Like 8-bit, 16-bit, arcade. Yeah, it seems to be they made something for the same amount of money. Comes also in a pretty nice box, so for the collectors I think it's pretty cool. And we can play a lot of great games. It's really funny to see that they just basically used the same shell like the previous model. And yeah, the internals are completely different of course, because we can play so much more now. But the price between those, let's say the 8-bit and the Famicom all-in-one device, was not that big. And I think it's very interesting. Even the reset button, everything is still in the same position. But also the display itself looks slightly better than the previous model. So when it comes to the emulation, it was, well, let's say perfect, but it was getting way better than all the previous models I've seen. And also we can do a quick load, quick save. How it is all possible for this cheap device. So with this more Family Pocket model, they did improve many things. Where it struggles with a lot of emulators in the previous models, the first generation of handhelds, with the Family Pocket, it seems to be they fixed also these issues. And games are running on pretty good speed, or basically the full 60 FPS. And where it struggles with the MAME, it runs way better than all the other previous models I have seen and reviewed in the last couple of years. So the Family Pocket fell out of the sky, and it completely surprises me. So when it comes to the TV out function with this device, it works very well and the image was not that bad. With the previous models, the image was not really clear, or it was really choppy gameplay, or it's really going to get even worse when you're going to play on TV out function. But this thing, managed to pull it off. It's AV out, sadly, and cheap devices, most of them don't have HDMI out. Maybe you can use a converter. But the reason why I put this thing so high in my list is because it's cheap, it supports a lot of different systems, the emulation was way better than other models, the TV out function included. So in overall, in combination with the price that you're paying for it, it's just a wow. And it's a handheld that surprises me. And that doesn't happen that often. The next package from China was very interesting. Reason why? Because with the BitBoy, this thing brings it to a completely different level. It's still cheap and it's still dirty cheap and you can still find them. There are quite some different versions out that take that into consideration. So far I know around 4 or 5 versions, yeah, seriously. But you need to get your one with the IPS display. These are not really expensive compared with a normal LCD. But what I did like about it is that not only the form factor, and the form factor was very compact, but a nice IPS display. We're still missing out some buttons in my opinion, only having 4 of them. But you had the Open Dingus version, so this means we can play a lot of systems. So we're not limited to the 5 that we're going to see with all of these cheap devices. And we even had the option to play games like Street of Rage Remake. Oh boy, I love those. But nevertheless, the gameplay was choppy sometimes, but now we're having the possibility to mess around with the emulators and get some of these emulators running better. It's still not perfect, it is far from perfect in my opinion, but still, we had a lot of options now. And if you're looking at the price range and what you can do with it, the BitBoy is higher up in my list because it was not that bad of a deal. In my opinion, the BitBoy was a big surprise back in the day because we didn't have a lot of options out there. Most of them had just horrible emulation, and this thing brought it to the next level, but with a very small amount of money that you needed to pay for it. Alright, so for my number 1 position I choose the 64-bit game, or better called the V90 from Powkiddy. And the reason why is very simple. The clamshell design is very rare and there are not a lot of handhelds that came in this form factor. But besides the form factor is that I love the display. It comes in an IPS display, it has Open Dingus and it just plays a lot of systems. Because with Open Dingus we can play a lot of stuff from the really old school stuff up to PlayStation 1. But I must say, PlayStation 1 didn't run perfectly, because it was a little bit underpowered for that. But when you're looking at what you're going to get for your money, it was cheap, it had an IPS display and clamshell design, it has Open Dingus, and it had some pretty good sound. Not perfect, because yeah, it's still a budget device, you can add games and there are some great things you can do with it. And this is the reason why I put this thing on the number 1 position, because I was really excited about the device. And again, it's just a budget product and it is very cheap, but how can they make it for the money? But take in consideration that this is just a budget device and it will have some flaws like not perfect audio. When you're playing Street of Rage Remake and you are a big fan of this game, you played a lot on other devices, you will see that it doesn't run the same speed like the PC version or this game on higher end devices. That's what you're going to get, so therefore, but still I just need to put this thing on my number 1 position because this is one of my favorite handhelds from this year and I just needed to put this in the budget list. Okay guys, so that concludes this top 10 for this year budget devices. And I wanted to make this especially to help you out guys in this jungle of handhelds, which one will especially fitting your personal needs. Yeah, let me know in the comments, what do you think of my top 10? Do you agree? Do you disagree? I really love to know from you. I want to thank you for watching. Consider subscribing, hit that little bell, become one of the Wicked family. It would be great to have you here on the channel. And I will see you in the next video in some more content, because I have a lot of great stuff coming up, a lot of great ideas. And it would be great to have you here. Hit the little bell and I will see you in the next video.